First story. I spent the holidays staying in an Airbnb that I leased 4 years ago. I chose a place that was only a few miles away from my family because I was spending Christmas week with them. Everything was just as I had imagined it would be on December 20th when I arrived. It was just an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood. I was happy with everything overall. On my first day, though, I had arrived at 6 Row, and I didn't feel like seeing anyone until I had had a decent night's sleep. I spent the remainder of the evening lounging around the house, watching TV, and even finishing a little work. Just before 10 How, I went to bed and slept. However, I awoke slowly in the middle of the night to sounds coming from downstairs. I didn't even check the clock because I was still half asleep, but it sounded like a few little thumps against the wall coming from someplace in the home. I assumed the noises were coming from the home and didn't really feel alarmed or anything while I listened to them. I don't remember waking up any additional times during the night. I was only up for a minute before falling back asleep. I had forgotten by morning and had not given those noises any more thought. I was very certain it had to do with the unit alone. Nevertheless, I informed my family that I had arrived in town, and we arranged to have supper at their house. Until I was ready to leave, I spent the entire morning and afternoon unwinding at the Airbnb. After grabbing my keys and bag, I approached the front door to leave the residence. However, as soon as I opened it, I saw a man standing on the porch directly in front of me. I was really unprepared for it, and I just stood there staring at him for a moment before I said anything. "Can I help you?" I inquired. I began to wonder how long the man may have been standing there and why he had come for the first place, because he didn't knock or ring the doorbell. But instead of answering my query, he simply nodded before turning to leave. I observed him descend to the pavement and simply stroll down the road until he vanished. There isn't a scenario that this wouldn't seem weird and unsettling in. How long did he stand there without knocking, and why was he at the Airbnb? I drove to my parents' house for dinner with the family after making sure the place was closed up. I mentioned the event as a fascinating anecdote, and it seemed that everyone else found it to be equally unsettling. Even yet, dinner was enjoyable, and we had many more wonderful discussions catching up on everything. However, I couldn't get the man out of my head that entire night, wondering whether my belongings from the Airbnb would be taken or whatever. I left the dinner gathering at about 9 o'clock and returned to the Airbnb 15 minutes later. After pulling into the driveway, I approached the front door and glanced around to see if there were any overt indications that someone had been there while I was away. However, I saw nothing. I opened the door and took a seat. I left my backpack and keys on the counter as I made my way to the kitchen at the end of the hallway. However, there was an abrupt thump. Though it was much louder and obviously coming from one side of the house now that I was downstairs, it was exactly the same as the ones I'd heard the night before. I cautiously moved into the room closest to the source of the sound, but as soon as I passed through the next door, I heard it again. I felt an adrenaline rush as I leaped back. After a few moments of peering at the door, I heard the faint sound of labored breathing coming from the other side. I hurried toward my car, grabbing my keys. Even though I was still unsure of the details, I had no intention of staying to find out for myself. I waited for them to arrive after dialing 911. When they did, I observed them enter and spend a few minutes looking about. When they eventually emerged, they horrified me by telling me that the person behind the door was the garage door, which had distress signals indicating that the person had probably tried to break the lock to get inside. I had no idea that the person who had slept here before me had left the side door, which led outside, unsecured and linked to the garage. I never checked the garage because I never intended to use it. I'm not sure if the man I saw on the porch was the same one that was in the garage, but it still scares me to think that I was asleep when someone was trying to break into the house just below me. We're not sure what they were hoping to accomplish after breaking in. Naturally, I went and spent the remainder of the week at a hotel after that, but even after 4 years, I still find myself thinking about that circumstance. Narrative 2. I took a trip a few weeks back and rented out a property on Airbnb. I was lodging in a tiny town close to some hiking trails that I really wanted to explore. I had no prior experience or knowledge of the location where I was staying. All I knew was that it was in a handy location for me and was a comparatively tiny town. It was getting late when I arrived at the Airbnb because the drive took me 9 hours in total. I parked on the street and carried my belongings up to the door after finding it, even though it was on a street with several other townhouses. From the outside, the property looked decent. Certainly nothing particularly new or noteworthy, but nothing out of the ordinary. Since there was no passcode for the door in any of my emails, I texted the owner to let them know I had arrived. I stood there staring out at the street while I waited for a few minutes. Then I heard a door open not far away, and I saw a smiling man come around the corner. As the Airbnb host, he greeted me, let me into the apartment, and promised to be right next door if I needed anything. That wasn't what I was expecting, but at least he went without saying anything too strange. After organizing my belongings in the bedroom, I took a quick tour of the house. I quickly went to bed after that. I had a brief breakfast the following day, and then drove to a route, which I trekked for about 4 hours. When I returned to the townhouse around 7 o'clock, something felt off. A few items in my room seemed to have been shifted somewhat. I simply had a sense that something had been tampered with, even though there is nothing missing that I am aware of. Apart from my unsubstantiated concerns, there wasn't much further evidence to support the idea that someone had entered during my absence. I was more certain after a half hour of exploring that this was just me being anxious about staying in a strange place. I was watching YouTube on my phone while eating dinner on the couch after forgetting about it and heating up a frozen dish. 11 hours, I went to bed at p.m. The bedroom was located at the end of the main corridor, across from the front door, as this was a one-story townhouse. It was a little difficult for me to feel comfortable because I was always used to sleeping upstairs. I continued falling asleep for a few minutes while I lay in bed, waking up and continuing this cycle of sleeplessness. But then, maybe an hour into the night, I was lying there, unable to fall back asleep, when I heard a door from across the house creaking open softly from outside the room. It sounded deliberate, as though they were making a stealthy opening. I listened, sitting up in my bed and staring at the door, but I heard nothing more. I stood up after a minute and went to the bedroom door, opening it slightly so I could see down the hallway. The front door was slightly open, as I could tell by the porch light's soft glow illuminating the space where it was. I retreated to the rear of the room and discreetly called the police after carefully and silently locking my door. I heard a creep just outside the bedroom door throughout the phone call, and when I peered at the bottom, I saw the outline and shadow of a person standing there. I cut them off right away and waited for them to leave before carrying on with the operator's report. Luckily, nothing else seemed to occur while I was waiting for the policeman to arrive. By then, they had left, but there were signs of a previous occupant everywhere you looked, including shoe prints. Even the police were convinced, so there was no question about it. However, even though I was certain it was the Airbnb host, they couldn't uncover any evidence other than the front door opening effortlessly. It's also unclear if they were inside the house when I left during the day. Since nothing was missing and they returned only after I did, I believe their motivations were related to me. I'm still plagued by thinking what might have happened, and whether they're still trying. Tale 3. My 2 best friends and I thought it would be fun to get together and hire out a house for the night for New Year's Eve last year. We preferred to spend our time together in our little group rather than attending large events. We all lived in dorm rooms, so even without parties, it sounded like a blast to have a house to ourselves for a change. In our current location, my friend Jason rented out an Airbnb on the outskirts. On New Year's Eve, about midday, Jason and I met up at the carpool spot, where I went with my other friend Christian. With its all-wood construction and traditional cabin features, this home was really more of a cabin than a standard house. Although there were other cabin houses nearby that looked similar, they were all fairly spaced apart, giving the impression that we were the only ones in the area. Although we weren't expecting luxury, the interior wasn't all that nice, but this was one of the less expensive options. After spending the entire day chatting and snacking in the living room, Christian left to get some beverages and snacks at around 6 o'clock. A knock on the door occurred while Jason and I were still seated in the living room. We exchanged shocked glances while realizing how strange it was for someone to be in this area and knock on an Airbnb host's door. I noticed a man standing on the threshold when I peered out the peephole after getting up. I flipped the door over and opened it just enough to see the metal latches on it after noticing they were there. Although I wouldn't normally answer the door to a random person, I wasn't sure if it was the host or whatever because I was in someone else's home. The man glanced at me and I was immediately conscious of his disapproving expression. Something seemed to be bothering him, and when he spoke, his anger got more pointed. We should remain quiet tonight so as not to disturb the entire neighborhood. He urged me in a tone that was both rude and intransigent. The way he said it was almost menacing, as if we had already started creating noise. But since all the houses were so far apart, and we hadn't done anything loud yet, even if he was a neighbor, there was no way he could have heard anything unless we were setting off fireworks or something. I just responded sure and shut the door in his face since I really wasn't in the mood to dispute. However, he knocked on the door again in an instant. That time I ignored him and gave Jason a strange look, acting as though he was insane. After a little while, we heard him disappear. When Christian returned, we informed him about the meeting, and he was almost not at all convinced. We spent the next 3 hours playing games on Jason's Switch and watching a movie. It was then almost midnight when we heard sounds outside. A few seconds later, there was the piercing sound of glass breaking immediately outside the door. It sounded like someone dropping something on the ground. We all got up and rushed to look out the window, where we saw the same person from before standing next to Christian's car, which was now covered in glass due to a cracked windshield. The man appeared to be in a psychotic state as he paced around and was acting completely out of control. He was wielding a metal baseball bat. Christian stormed outside to face him because he was furious and went to the door. Jason and I hurried to stop him, but a gunshot rang out in the cabin before we could reach the door. Even though I knew what had probably happened, I halted in mid-air and watched it in disbelief as Christian dashed back inside and shut the door. A few more rounds struck the side of the cabin, and then the man struck the front door with the bat. Then the man simply fled just as abruptly as it had all begun. It was discovered after an inquiry that he wasn't even the Airbnb's neighbor. It appears that no one is aware of his identity, residence, or the reason behind his complete insanity. We had an extremely frightening and unpredictable encounter that nearly resulted in our deaths.